The US and China dominate the cloud and have been spearheading AI development. But countries from Saudi Arabia to India to Taiwan are determined not to let AI become the next global duopoly. They want their own data, models, and infrastructure to be in their own hands. In other words, they're racing to develop sovereign AI. But is full autonomy possible, and is it worth the price? I'm Divya Gopalan, and you're watching Connected on Taiwan Plus. For an overview on how Taiwan and other countries are developing their sovereign AI, we have with us in the US, Charles Mok. He's a tech entrepreneur, former Hong Kong legislator, and research scholar at Stanford University. And from Taiwan, we have Simon Sun, assistant professor at the Institute of Technology Law of National Yangming Jiaotong University in Hsinchu. Thank you both so much for being on the program. Simon, I'm going to start with you first. How do you describe sovereign AI? What is sovereign AI?
Yeah, so it's good to be here. So sovereign AI, broadly describing, would be a nation's capability to independently develop, maintain, and deploy its own AI system. And that means that you do not, or at least have minimal dependence on either foreign cloud or foreign tech giants. That also means that you have public data, you can build your own model in some cases, and also an important component is having a robust infrastructure involved.
All right, so before we look at what each country is doing, Charles, where did the idea of sovereign AI start?
People have been talking about data sovereignty, internet sovereignty, and so on. So to me, this is just an extension to the concept of the artificial intelligence technology in the industry. But if we're looking at the kind of origin of this, I agree with Simon that it has a lot to do with countries trying to develop their own capabilities, both as a point of technology independence, but at the same time also capturing the market opportunity. And increasingly, I think countries, all different countries are looking at it from the point of view of not only technology independence, but also national security and economic security.
All right, speaking of countries developing capabilities, let's take a look at who's ahead or who is gaining the most traction here. The flagship models of the world, like ChatGPT, were developed on massive compute clusters. So let's get an overview of the nations with the most compute resources. The United States has by far the most advanced AI computing power, and nearly 40 million H100 equivalent chips. It also has almost 3 times the energy capacity of its nearest competitor. Now, that combination is what allows the US to train the biggest, most capable AI models at scale. From what you can see there, the UAE comes second. It has made aggressive investments in AI infrastructure and data centers, and so has Saudi Arabia, which ranks third. Now, South Korea leads the pack in Asia, far ahead of China, which is in 7th place, just behind India. But China's on top when it comes to AI acceleration clusters, with the US second and France a distant third, followed by Korea and Germany. Now, AI clusters are large groups of powerful computers linked together to work as one. More clusters mean a country can train and run advanced AI systems at a much larger scale. Taiwan is in a shared 17th place with 2 clusters, and the most recent one was launched in December. So Simon, when you talk about sovereign AI, it means massive compute power, talent, and data. Can a place like Taiwan have all of them, given its population limitations and its network limitations?
Yeah, so I think we need to be strategic here, right? Like there are several components that we can start working on, or at least in the progress of working on. And obviously, I think data itself is where the relatively easier part that we can start developing and building our own database and to gather more high quality and localized information, I think, relative to other components that we need.
So, Charles, let's take a look at China. It has the most clusters, but far less compute power. How has that influenced how China is developing its sovereign AI? And is it a model that other countries with limited resources can follow?
Right now, this is just like 1 year anniversary of the DeepSeek shock that we remember about a year ago when most people in the world just first time heard about DeepSeek. I think the fact is that also because of the restrictions or limitations that China is facing, it actually forced the country to invest a lot more into trying to find a better way out to do something with less resources. And they have been quite successful with that. So it's relatively, to me, it's relatively difficult to just assess the success of different countries merely by looking at these metrics, because sometimes, they may bring out different results, or you cannot really just look at these ranking and say that, one country is doing better and other countries is doing worse. For example, take the example of Taiwan. Obviously, Taiwan has a it has a great lead on many other countries in terms of the chip manufacturing and so on. So every country may have somewhere that it might be doing better than others, which makes other countries dependent on them.
Right. I'm glad you brought up Taiwan. Let's look at Taiwan's ambitions. Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te recently laid out the government's plan for the country's AI industry to grow to $500 billion in output. Here's some of what he recently announced.
Facing the global AI wave, our government will continue to leverage Taiwan's advantages by promoting the 10 new AI infrastructure initiatives. This will help Taiwan build a full AI ecosystem across digital foundations, critical technologies, and smart applications. Our goal is to create an output value over 15 trillion NT dollars, 500,000 AI jobs, and establish 3 international level AI laboratories by 2040. Transforming Taiwan into a keynote for global AI innovation. We aim to make Taiwan one of the world's top 5 computing centers, help all sectors adopt AI tools, and promote the application of AI across a range of fields, striving to make Taiwan an AI island.
So, Simon, going off what Charles has said about Taiwan's semiconductor industry and being far ahead in that space, how much, in a sense, does Taiwan already have AI sovereignty, given that the fact that it produces all those advanced chips that the rest of the world are using?
Yeah, so I think Taiwan is in a very interesting place. So there are 2 components, right? There's the infrastructure part, and that's what Charles has talked about. The chip industry obviously has a lot of momentum and has been critical, and there's still I think a lot of room to grow here, right? But as at the same time, chip design. There are a lot of components of the chips industry that we can still work on. The second part is the software itself. We do not have a lot of, or at least enough momentum for software companies to build among sort of the hardware. So we're still trying very hard on the different stacks here.
Charles, from what we heard President Lai Ching-te say, what's jumped out at you about Taiwan's blueprint for building its own version of AI, or versions?
Yeah, what I heard from President Lai, I think it's encouraging on one level to see that the country is looking at having a series of KPIs, key performance indicators, to measure itself in terms of number of jobs and output and so on, which is good. But I think the more important thing is how to get there. It's easy to have to talk about setting a goal, but it's very important to see how you're going to develop the different factors that will lead to success, from capital to manpower to market access and so on. He talked about making Taiwan an AI island. Well, while Taiwan is definitely an island, you don't want to be an island and be separated by from the rest of the world. That doesn't really help you. So how to be connected to the outside is also very important, both in the infrastructure sense and also in the business sense. So to me, I think my biggest worry is that like Simon also mentioned, I think Taiwan has not to me, Taiwan has a very good track record in terms of developing its software industry, its service industry, and so on. So how does the government now how will it be able to develop a very viable and successful industry policy in those areas as compared to the very successful hardware, electronic strategy, industry strategy in those areas? That is a challenge. So I would think that looking at some of these metrics that he mentioned, it sounds very familiar to me compared to the things that I've heard countries or governments like Singapore or Hong Kong has been talking about. But Singapore probably has been doing quite better than Hong Kong in this regard, and I think there might be some lesson to be learned from that country.
Right. So Simon, going back to what Charles said, that balance of public and private initiatives, and what role do you think Taiwan's government should play, and how much should the initiative towards sovereign AI be private enterprises in the way we're seeing how the U.S. operates?
Right. So we've been using a term called infrastructure, right? So infrastructure, of course, it has its technological meaning the hardware itself that can support the building of a system. But there's also the component of what it means economically, right? So in economic terms, when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about electricity, right? Railroads, highways, and stuff. So the idea of a sovereign AI, or at least what Taiwan is trying to do now, I think from that perspective, is that if we treat AI as an infrastructure from an economic terms, it means that government actually has to provide more fundings, it has to be more active, instead of just letting the market sort of play around and to expect maybe something magical would come up. And I think President Lai Ching-te's speech really demonstrated that, saying that the government is jumping down, money is being poured in. We have identified several sectors, or at least areas that we want to work on.
So Charles, before we wrap up this segment, it piqued my interest when you talked about learning from others' mistakes when you were talking about Hong Kong and Singapore. So I want to understand where you were going with that.
Well, when I was talking about the experience from countries such as Singapore, I think, at least to me, they have been doing it for quite a while and having quite a level of success, in the sense that for a very small economy, much smaller than actually, in terms of population or GDP, smaller than Taiwan, but doing quite well in the service economy area. And I think what they have been doing has been using public resources from sovereign fund of the government to invest in different kinds of company, both domestic and international, particularly helping domestic companies grow the market from government and local consumption of the products that the Singapore companies produces, as well as pretty robust training and retraining strategy to build out the kind of manpower manpower that they need, and also import manpower when it's necessary. So it's not just talking about AI and so on. A lot of it actually has to do with how to make businesses, both domestic and local, domestic and international, able to become a global player. And I think in that regard, actually, Taiwan has quite a bit of challenge in terms of relative restricted capital flow and so on. How easy it is to open up a bank account in Taiwan. I mean, a lot of international companies are quite challenged by that. So there are a lot of these issues that still needs to be tackled, and it's not just the technology.
Right, so we're going to look at some of those challenges and how they can be overcome in our next segment. But before that, a quick check-in with our viewers. If you would like to join the conversation and stay connected to tech and business stories from Taiwan, follow us on our socials. Next, we look at Taiwan's latest moves to create its own AI and whether it's heading in the right direction. Stick around. Taiwan is attempting to create its own AI models, adjusted to its culture, languages, and democratic system. As AI operations permeate institutions and education, there is concern that the US and China, through their advanced models, will have undue influence. So the government is counting on local companies and institutions to develop sovereign AI that works for Taiwan by providing resources and inputs. Now, to understand how Taiwan's model of AI development compares to other players and whether it's heading in the right direction, we have with us Simon Sun. He's an assistant professor at the Institute of Technology Law at National Yang-Ming Chiao Tung University in Hsinchu, and from the US, Charles Mok, a tech entrepreneur, former Hong Kong legislator, and research scholar at Stanford University. Now, Simon, I'm going to start with you here. Taiwan has just passed its first AI law. What do you think it says about Taiwan's ambitions for sovereign AI, and does it seem aligned with that?
Yeah, so we just passed the first AI regulation that is called the AI Basic Act. So what the AI Basic Act says is that it basically sets the tone of basic principles of developing artificial intelligence, and also making sure that we know what each governmental entity is going to do. The biggest conversation that we had during the passage of the AI Basic Act is that whether we wanted to adopt a risk-based approach. So a risk-based approach basically means that we identify certain risks that emerge from artificial intelligence. This is a governance mechanism that was largely inspired by the EU AI Act. So then the question is, if we adopt this law, if we enact this law, how much of that risk-based component is going to be part of the regulation? In terms of building sovereign AI, the main fear was that if there were too much regulation, then this would mean that it would influence the tech space, because they would have to face a lot of compliance. But at the same time, there's a lot of research that has shown the negative impacts of artificial intelligence, and that we have to just be sure that everything is going to be safe. It's kind of like having a seatbelt in a car, right? So you need to make sure that there's a seatbelt in place. And over the past few different versions, I think what actually really reflected our direction towards sovereign AI is this change of having different levels of risk, which is existed in the original draft, turning into a risk classification, which is just to identify different types of risk. So these are the little nuances that we want to make sure that we balance innovation and also safety.
Now, I want to stay with the topic of legal framework here and take it to the US. Now, Charles, I understand that there are lawsuits emerging with regards to scraping data. Would you say current U.S. regulation is keeping up with the development of these large language models? And how is the U.S. regulating it?
Well, the U.S. is trying not to regulate it. At least that is what the current Trump administration's attitude toward regulations overall. I think in the past several years, in terms of technology and particularly including AI regulation, we're seeing three particular models. The European models, which is more based on a risk-based approach, where they try to define pretty clearly what are the different levels of risk, even though that is admittedly very difficult, especially for emerging technology. And they try to assess and levy certain kinds of punishment or requirements on these companies and so on. That is the risk-based approach. But in terms of the U.S., they push back a lot on this type of approach because, as Simon was saying, that the U.S., the American mentality is that this is going to inhibit innovation, and the laws, are just going to be restricting new innovation and make it difficult for AI models to advance and so on. So they take a different approach to say that, forget about this for the moment. We will come back to it when we see some problems emerge. But in the meantime, particularly for the Trump administration compared to the previous administration, they focus a lot more on propagating and promoting the adoption of the AI tech stack from the US internationally. So it's more about, making sure that the American technology, American AI tech stack is going to be adopted by countries, other countries, rather than, obviously, rather than those countries, let's say, selecting the Chinese model. So they take much more of a business and competitive approach. Now, even in Europe, we're seeing some pushback. And because of competition, quite a lot of European private sector companies and even some governments are saying that, well, maybe we don't want it to restrict the innovation too much by having too much regulation. So there's a continuous debate in this area. What I'm seeing in Taiwan, and also similarly in Japan and Korea, that has recently, Korea also passed a similar, well, not exactly similar, but they also call it kind of like a AI Basic Act, is that I think countries in Asia are trying to balance between the need of regulations with the need for these countries to develop their own sovereign AI infrastructure, and also promotes the technology adoption and competition, making the country more competitive in the AI stage in the world. So I do see that Asian countries are trying to balance it more, balance between the kind of the risk-based approach and the American, kind of
Free for all. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Simon, Taiwan launched a so-called sovereign AI training corpus. Now, it's basically a huge collection of data for companies to train their AI on, and it's just celebrated its 1 billionth piece of data. Now, how useful is this quote-unquote ethical data, and is it being seen as effective in for these companies to train these models, given that if they're all working with the same kind of data, is there really competition, Simon?
Yeah, so the data economy is, or at least, how do you think about data is obviously, it's a very complicated issue. So when it comes to regulations, there's privacy concerns on the different types of data. There's also the copyright protection concern. So, having a sort of like a public, quote unquote, public data that everyone can use, obviously, in a way, diminishes that concern of copyright and sort of the privacy concern that your personal data is being part of this, or at least is being connected. At the same time, you do see a downside that representation matters, right? So what is represented and what is not represented. So this is a very, very delicate sort of line to draw. Obviously, we want enough data so that we can have better models. Not any data, right? Like Reddit has been a very critical source on training a lot of models. But at the same time, we want data that is high quality. But a lot of these times, these high quality data are copyright protected. So again, we're trying to draw this line of having enough representation, but also respecting people's copyright protection and also privacy protection.
Yeah, well, one thing you mentioned there earlier, Charles, was the fact that the U.S. wants to see its models promoted internationally. In that case, is AI used as a way of soft power? And on the back of that, the fact that most of the U.S.'s most successful AI models are all privately owned, can they really be considered sovereign AI?
Well, that's a good question. But in the U.S., I don't think they have a very strong tradition of the government directly getting involved into training the models and so on. And not to mention, actually, right now, at least technologically or in terms of market share, some of the biggest and most successful companies that are developing these models all happen to be American companies anyway. And also probably because of the fact that traditionally on the internet, in terms of data, a lot of these data are coming from, American or Western sources. So I don't think they feel an urgency, compared to other, let's say, global South countries or other middle power countries in terms of developing their own AI sovereignty models, because they already have it in a way. So I guess the urgency for them is more about maintaining the technological advantage and competitiveness against their biggest rival, which is China.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. This has been such an interesting conversation. Charles Mok speaking to us from Palo Alto and Simon Sun in Hsinchu. Thank you very much. And to our viewers, it has been good to have your company today. If you'd like more tech and business stories from Taiwan, follow us on our socials where we keep you informed, engaged, and connected.